The 12th of October, 1492. That is the day. Not a war, not a coronation, not the fall of a great city. Just a man stepping off a wooden boat onto a beach he did not recognize, in a world he did not understand, planting a flag in the name of a kingdom that had no idea what he had just found. And yet that single morning, that one act on one small strip of sand somewhere in the Caribbean would set in motion a chain of events so vast, so irreversible, and so violent that the world would never again be what it had been the night before. This is the story of the day. Christopher Columbus changed the world forever, and whether you admire him or condemn him, one thing is undeniable. Before that morning, there were two separate human worlds that had never met. After it, there was only one, and the collision between them would define everything that followed. Here is the question I want you to sit with from the very beginning. What does it actually feel like to live through the moment when the world splits in two? Not to read about it afterward, not to see it in a painting, but to be there, on that beach, on that ship, in that October dawn, with no idea what is really happening, because none of them knew. Not Columbus, not the sailors, not the people watching from the shore. And that is precisely what makes this day so extraordinary and so haunting. What this video is going to do is take you inside that specific moment, hour by hour, decision by decision, human being by human being. We are going to look at the weeks leading up to that morning, the near collapse of the entire voyage, the desperation on both sides of the ocean, and then the extraordinary chain of consequences that one day in 1492 unleashed on the entire world. By the end, you will not just know what happened, you will understand why it happened, what it cost, what it created, and why a single human decision made on a fragile wooden ship in the middle of the Atlantic still shapes the world you live in today. Let us begin where every great story begins, at the edge. It is the late summer of 1492 and three small wooden ships are moving west across the Atlantic Ocean. The largest of them, the Santa Maria, is roughly 30 meters long. The other two, the Pinta and the Nina, are even smaller. Together, they carry approximately 90 men into an ocean that most educated Europeans at the time knew was crossable in theory, but that no one from their world had ever crossed to the west and returned to tell about it. Think about that for a moment. Not the danger of falling off the edge of the world. That was largely a myth. Even then, most educated people in 1492 knew the earth was round. The real fear was something far more rational: running out of food, running out of water, winds that might not carry them back, a sea that might simply go on forever. Columbus had sailed from Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain on August 3rd, 1492, carrying with him a contract signed by the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, promising him the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, the governorship of any lands he discovered, and 10% of all the wealth those lands might produce. It was an extraordinary agreement, almost reckless in its generosity, but Ferdinand and Isabella had calculated the risk carefully. If Columbus failed, they lost almost nothing. If he succeeded, Spain would have a direct route to the spice markets of Asia, bypassing the Ottoman-controlled overland routes and the Portuguese monopoly along the African coast. The potential reward was enormous. The cost of the gamble was relatively small, but Columbus had not arrived at that contract easily. He had spent years, literally years, trying to convince someone to fund him. He had approached the Portuguese crown first. They rejected him. He had been waiting in Spain for almost 7 years, repeatedly petitioning, being denied, being asked to wait, being told the moment was not right. There's something almost painful about imagining those years. A man absolutely convinced he knows something others do not, carrying his calculations and his maps from one court to another, watching the months turn into years, while the idea that had consumed him aged in his hands. He was not young anymore when those ships finally left the harbor. He was around 40 years old, which in 1492 was the beginning of old age. This voyage was not a young man's adventure. It was a middle-aged man's last bet, and by late September of 1492, that bet looked like it might be lost. The crew was frightened. They had been at sea for weeks. The winds had been favorable, which should have been reassuring, but the problem with favorable westward winds is that they made the sailors wonder how they would ever get home. The magnetic compass was also behaving strangely as they moved west, its declination shifting in ways the men could not explain, and in a world where the compass was one of your only tools for knowing where you were, that was terrifying. Columbus knew about magnetic declination and understood it as a natural phenomenon. His crew did not. To them, it felt like the sea itself had broken the rules. Columbus kept 2 logs of the voyage. One was accurate, recording the true distances he believed they had traveled. The other was a shorter, deliberately conservative estimate that he shared with the crew, intending to make the journey seem less daunting. Whether this was wise leadership or deception depends entirely on how you look at it. But here is the extraordinary irony. Modern analysis of both logs suggests that Columbus's deliberately understated distances were actually closer to the truth than his private calculations. He was, without knowing it, lying to his crew with numbers that happened to be more accurate than the ones he kept to himself. By early October, the mood on the ships had deteriorated sharply. There is historical evidence of growing tension, of men whispering among themselves, of the question hanging in the salt air, when do we turn back? Columbus records in his journal that the men were frightened and that they pressed him on more than one occasion to reverse course. Some accounts speak of a near mutiny, though the word mutiny may be too dramatic for what was actually a series of increasingly urgent conversations between Columbus and his captains about the limits of how far they could reasonably go. Columbus's response, documented in his own log, was to push on. He reportedly told the men he had come to find the Indies and would continue until he did. On October 7th, the Nina fired a cannon, the signal agreed upon by the fleet to indicate a land sighting. The crew celebrated, but the celebration was brief and bitter. It had been a false alarm. There was no land, only ocean. The disappointment that followed that false alarm was arguably the lowest point of the entire voyage. These men had been at sea for over 2 months. They were tired, frightened, and now freshly disappointed. The question of turning back became more urgent than ever. And here is where you start to understand the true weight of what was about to happen. On October 11th, the day before everything changed, Columbus noted in his log that the signs of land were multiplying. The crews were seeing green weeds, branches with berries on them, a carved stick in the water, a land bird. Small things, easy to dismiss, but collectively compelling. Columbus reportedly increased the promised reward for the first man to sight land. The original agreement with the Spanish crown promised 10,000 maravedis per year for life to the first sailor who spotted land. Columbus had added his own personal bonus on top of that. The men were watching. They were watching with everything they had. That night, October 11th into October 12th, Columbus himself wrote in his log that around 10 o'clock at night he saw a light in the distance, a small wavering light that he described as like a little wax candle rising and falling. He pointed it out to 2 other men on the ship. One confirmed it, one was not sure. Nobody could be certain what it was. It may have been a fire on the beach, it may have been bioluminescence in the water, it may have been something else entirely. Columbus did not fire the cannon. He did not declare land. He watched. Then, at 2 in the morning, on October 12th, 1492, a sailor on the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana saw something different. He saw a continuous white line along the horizon. Not a flicker, not a shimmer, a coastline. He shouted the word that every man on those 3 ships had been waiting weeks to hear. Tierra, land. He shouted it into the dark Atlantic night, and the word traveled across the water to the other ships, and the sound it made when it landed was the sound of a world ending and another one beginning. But here is the detail that history is never fully resolved, and it matters more than most people realize. Columbus later claimed, in his official report to the Spanish crown, that he had been the first to see the light the previous night, and on the basis of that claim, he kept the lifetime pension for himself rather than awarding it to Rodrigo de Triana. Whether Columbus genuinely believed he had spotted land first, or whether he deliberately deprived a poor sailor of his reward to keep the money, is something no one can say with certainty. But Rodrigo de Triana is said to have spent the rest of his life in poverty, And Columbus collected the pension. That small injustice, that contested moment in the dark before dawn, is in some ways a perfect opening chapter for everything that followed. They did not land immediately. The ships stood off the coast until first light, moving carefully, watching the shoreline take shape in the gray Atlantic dawn. And as the light grew, they began to see figures on the shore. People, human beings standing on the beach, watching the ships the same way the sailors were watching them, with a mixture of curiosity and something that must have been close to disbelief. These were the Lucayan people, a branch of the Arawak-speaking Taino, who had been living on this island, which they called Guanahani, for generations. They had no frame of reference for what they were seeing. Large wooden structures on the water, enormous white cloths catching the wind, strange figures in unfamiliar clothing. It must have been one of the most genuinely alien sights any human being has ever witnessed. Columbus and a party of armed men rowed ashore in small boats. He was wearing a scarlet doublet. He carried the royal standard of Spain. He planted it in the ground, knelt, gave thanks to God, and formally took possession of the island in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. He renamed it San Salvador. He did this in front of the people who lived there, whose name for the island he had just been told, whose ownership of it was the only ownership that had ever existed. He did it without a second thought, because within his legal and cultural framework, unclaimed land, meaning land not held by a Christian sovereign, was available to be claimed. The Lucayan people watching from a few meters away were not part of that framework. They were not consulted. They were not compensated. They were simply witnesses to a ceremony that decided their fate. Columbus's log entry for that day is one of the most consequential documents in human history, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. He describes the Taino people as handsome, gentle, and generous. He notes that they brought food and fresh water to the sailors willingly. He observes that they had no iron weapons, that when he showed them a sword, they grabbed it by the blade and cut themselves out of ignorance. And then, in the same paragraph, almost in the same breath, he writes that they would make good servants, and that with 50 armed men, they could all be subjugated and made to do whatever one wished. That sentence was written on the same day he arrived. The same day, not after months of conflict, not after any provocation. On the day of first contact, Columbus simultaneously recognized the humanity and the vulnerability of the people he had found, and immediately identified the vulnerability as an opportunity. That is the sentence that contains everything that followed. That one sentence is the hinge on which history turned. Now, if you are finding this story as compelling as we think you are, take a second right now and hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who love history as much as you do. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. We publish these kinds of deep historical stories regularly, and you do not want to miss what we have coming next. Columbus spent the following days exploring the surrounding islands. He was looking for Japan. He was looking for China. He was looking for the great cities of gold described by Marco Polo. He found none of them. He found islands. He found people. He found parrots and fruit and gold jewelry worn by some of the Taino, which he noted carefully. He acquired several Taino individuals, taking them aboard his ships against their will to serve as guides and interpreters. He called all the people he encountered Indians, because he was absolutely convinced he was somewhere in the outer islands of Asia. He never abandoned that conviction entirely during his lifetime. He died in 1506, still claiming he had reached Asia. The irony of that stubborn certainty is almost beyond comprehension. The man who found a new world refused to believe it was new. Over the following weeks, he sailed south and west, discovering Cuba and Hispaniola, the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It was on Hispaniola that the voyage took its first truly catastrophic turn. On Christmas night, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef and was lost. Columbus used the timber from the wreck to build a small fort on the Haitian coast, which he called La Navidad. He left 39 men there when he sailed back to Spain in January 1493. He promised them he would return. He returned in November 1493 with a much larger fleet, 17 ships, 1,200 men, He found La Navidad burned to the ground, and the 39 men dead. The causes remain somewhat unclear, though there is strong evidence of conflict between the Spanish soldiers and the local Taíno population, likely triggered by violence and theft on the part of the Spaniards. It was a dark omen, but it did not slow the colonization. It accelerated it, because Columbus had already returned to Spain in March 1493 and delivered his report to Ferdinand and Isabella, and that report had changed everything. The news Columbus brought back to Europe in 1493 spread with extraordinary speed. He had written a letter before he even landed, summarizing what he had found, and that letter was printed and distributed across Europe within weeks. It reached Rome, it reached Florence, it reached London. Within a year of Columbus's return, educated people across Europe knew that something enormous had been found across the Western Ocean. They did not know what it was yet. They did not have the conceptual framework for a previously unknown continent. But they knew the world was larger than they had believed, and that the implications of that largeness were incalculable. The Portuguese were alarmed. They had been building their own route to Asia for decades, sending ships down the African coast toward the Cape of Good Hope. Now Spain had apparently found another way. The two Iberian powers went immediately to the Pope, who in 1493 issued a series of documents known as the Intercaetera Bulls, dividing the non-European world between Spain and Portugal along a line of longitude running through the Atlantic. Everything to the west of that line belonged to Spain. Everything to the east belonged to Portugal. The entire non-European world, its peoples, its lands, its resources, was divided between two kingdoms by a document issued in Rome without the knowledge or consent of a single person who actually lived in any of those places. The following year, the Treaty of Tordesillas between Spain and Portugal adjusted the line slightly further west, which incidentally put Brazil on Portugal's side, which is why Brazilians speak Portuguese today. Think about that. The language spoken by 200 million people today is the direct result of a line drawn on a map in 1,494 inches response to Columbus landing on a beach 2 years earlier. That is what consequence looks like when it truly has no limit. Columbus made 4 voyages in total, between 1492 and 1504. Each one went further, found more, and brought more violence in its wake. On his second voyage, he established the first permanent European settlement in the Americas at La Isabela on Hispaniola. He instituted a system of tribute requiring every Taíno adult to deliver a fixed quantity of gold or cotton to the Spanish every 3 months. Those who failed to deliver had their hands cut off. This is documented. It is not disputed. It happened. Within a generation, the Taíno people of Hispaniola, estimated to have numbered somewhere between several 100,000 and several million at the time of contact, were gone. The causes were multiple: European diseases to which they had no immunity, forced labor, violence, and displacement. But whatever the precise numbers and proportions, the outcome was total. The people Columbus had described as gentle and generous on the day he arrived had been destroyed. Columbus himself was eventually arrested. In 1500, a royal commissioner named Francisco de Bobadilla arrived on Hispaniola, investigated the governance of the colony, and sent Columbus back to Spain in chains. Columbus was never executed. His titles and rights were eventually partially restored. But he died in 1506, having lost most of what he had been promised, still insisting he had reached Asia, still fighting legal battles over his entitlements, still convinced that he deserved more recognition than he had received. There is something genuinely tragic about that death. A man who had done something no one in his world had ever done, who had set in motion forces that would reshape the entire planet, dying in relative obscurity, misunderstood even by himself. And yet the world he had set in motion kept moving. This is where the story truly opens up, and this is where you start to feel the full, almost incomprehensible weight of that one October morning. Within 50 years of Columbus landing on that beach, Spanish conquistadors had toppled the Aztec Empire in Mexico and the Inca Empire in South America, two of the largest, most sophisticated civilizations in the world, with millions of people, complex governments, monumental architecture, and deep agricultural knowledge, were gone, not weakened, Gone. The speed of it is still staggering. Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, in 1519. The city fell in 1521. Tenochtitlan was, at that moment, one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that some estimates put at 200,000 people, larger than any city in Spain at the time. Within 2 years of first contact, it was destroyed. Francisco Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1532 and executed him the following year. An empire that stretched thousands of kilometers down the western coast of South America, that had built roads and storehouses and communication systems of extraordinary sophistication, was dismantled in less than a decade. The gold and silver that followed transformed Europe. Between 1,500 and 1,650, an estimated 180,000 kilograms of gold and 16 million kilograms of silver were shipped from the Americas to Spain. Those numbers require a moment of quiet to absorb. The silver mines at Potosí in what is now Bolivia were the largest in the world and remained so for over a century. The flood of precious metal into the European economy caused inflation across the continent, disrupted traditional trade patterns, funded the Spanish Habsburg Empire's wars across Europe, and accelerated the development of the early modern financial system. Scholars have argued that the silver from the Americas was one of the primary drivers of the global trade network that eventually connected Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas into a single economic system. The world economy, as we understand it, was, in a meaningful sense, born from the consequences of that October landing. The biological exchange that followed is called the Columbian Exchange, a term coined by the historian Alfred Crosby in 1972, and it may be the most transformative ecological event in the last 10,000 years. Plants, animals, and diseases moved in both directions across the Atlantic and Pacific in the wake of Columbus. From the Americas to Europe and the rest of the world went potatoes, tomatoes, maize, cacao, tobacco, chili peppers, vanilla, peanuts, sweet potatoes, and hundreds of other crops. The potato alone reshaped the agricultural history of Europe. Ireland's population grew from roughly 1 million to 8 million in the 18th and 19th centuries, largely because of the potato, a crop that had no presence in Europe before 1492. The tomato, which is now so central to Italian cooking that it is difficult to imagine the cuisine without it, did not exist in Italy before the 16th century. The foods that define entire cultures, that seem ancient and deeply rooted, are in many cases the direct descendants of plants that crossed the Atlantic because Columbus ran his ship onto a beach. From Europe went wheat, rice, horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and, most devastating of all, diseases: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. The indigenous populations of the Americas had no immunity to these diseases, having been geographically isolated from the Eurasian disease pool for thousands of years. The death toll was catastrophic. Estimates vary widely among historians, but there is broad scholarly consensus that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following contact. Some estimates suggest the total death toll may have reached 50 million people or more. To put that in perspective, the population of the entire world in 1500 was approximately 500 million people. The Americas lost between a quarter and a fifth of the global population within a century. The scale of that loss is almost impossible to hold in the mind. It is larger than any war in human history, larger than the Black Death in proportional terms in many regions, and it began with the arrival of 3 small wooden ships on an October morning. Now pause for just a moment here, because what we are about to describe is perhaps the most consequential and the most terrible chain of events that flows directly from Columbus's landing, and it involves something that is still shaping the world today. The labor collapse that followed the mass death of indigenous populations in the Americas created an enormous demand for workers to mine the silver, tend the sugar plantations, and perform the brutal physical work of colonial extraction. The Spanish and Portuguese colonists turned to Africa. The Atlantic slave trade, which had existed in limited form before 1492, exploded in scale and horror in the decades following Columbus, between approximately 1,500 and 900, somewhere between 10 and 12.5 million African people were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. An estimated 1.5 to 2 million died during the crossing alone. The cultures, nations, families, and futures of tens of millions of people on 2 continents were destroyed or deformed by a trade that would not have existed in anything like its historical form without the colonial project that Columbus initiated. The African diaspora that resulted from the slave trade shaped the demography, culture, music, language, religion, and politics of the entire Western Hemisphere. The United States of America, as it exists today, would be literally inconceivable without the history of slavery, and the history of slavery in the Americas is inconceivable without the colonial project that began on October 12, 1492. There is a straight, unbroken line from that beach in the Bahamas to the civil rights movement of the 20th century, not a metaphorical line, a historical one running through specific laws, specific ships, specific plantations, specific human beings whose names we mostly do not know. If you have been watching this far and you are feeling the weight of this story, please take a moment to share this video with someone who loves history. These stories deserve to be heard. And leave a comment below. We genuinely read them. Tell us what you think would have happened if Columbus had turned back on October 10th, just 2 days before landfall. Would someone else have found the Americas? Would the world be different? We would love to hear your thinking. The political geography of the modern world is another direct legacy of 1492. The nation-states of Central and South America, the borders of the Caribbean, the Spanish-speaking world that stretches from Mexico to Argentina and includes tens of millions of people in the United States, the Portuguese-speaking world anchored by Brazil, the French and English colonial presence in North America that eventually produced Canada and the United States. All of this flows from the chain of events Columbus set in motion. The specific shape of the modern world, its languages, its borders, its power structures, its inequalities, cannot be understood without going back to that morning on that beach. Even the date itself became contested. In 1937, Franklin D. Roosevelt declared October 12th Columbus Day, a federal holiday in the United States. For decades, it was celebrated without ambiguity. In recent decades, many American cities and states have replaced it with Indigenous Peoples Day, a change that reflects the growing recognition that the story of 1492 has more than one perspective, and that the people who were already on that beach when the boats arrived deserve to be part of the narrative. The argument over what to call the holiday is, in miniature, the argument about how to understand the entire modern world. It is an argument that has no clean resolution, because the truth of 1492 contains both genuine human achievement and genuine human catastrophe, and pretending otherwise in either direction does not serve the truth. Columbus was not a monster by the standards of his time and place, and he was not a hero by ours. He was a man of his age, deeply religious, genuinely courageous, possessed of an extraordinary navigational gift, and capable of both wonder at what he found and brutality toward the people who were there. The contradictions in his character are not incidental. They are the point, because the world he made was also a world of contradictions, of civilization and violence, of discovery and destruction, of connection and exploitation, and we are still living inside those contradictions today. He crossed an ocean no European had crossed before. That took courage, skill, and a willingness to endure uncertainty that most people in any era would not have managed. He also enslaved people on the day he met them, not metaphorically, literally. The first group of Taino he encountered, he brought back to Spain as living specimens, as proof of what he had found. Both of those things are true simultaneously. They were true on the same day. They happened within hours of each other on October 12th, 1492. And that is what makes that day not just consequential, but deeply, enduringly uncomfortable. It is a day we cannot simply celebrate or simply mourn. We have to hold it whole in all its complexity, because That is the only honest way to understand it. The world before that morning had been, in a very real sense, two separate worlds. The Eastern Hemisphere, with its connected civilizations stretching from Europe through the Middle East to China and India, had been in contact with itself for millennia, trading, warring, sharing diseases, ideas, technologies, and religions across vast distances. The Western Hemisphere, the Americas, had been developing in parallel, in complete isolation, for at least 15,000 years. The civilizations there were extraordinary in their own right. The Maya had developed one of the most sophisticated calendrical systems in the world. The Aztecs had built a city larger than any in contemporary Europe. The Inca had organized a vast state without writing or money, using a system of knotted strings called quipus to record information across an empire thousands of kilometers long. The Mississippian cultures of North America had built ceremonial centers of remarkable scale. These were not primitive peoples awaiting discovery. They were fully realized human societies with their own histories, their own achievements, and their own futures that were taken from them. After October 12, 1492, those two worlds collided, and the collision was overwhelmingly one-directional in terms of destruction. The people of the Americas paid an almost incalculable price for a contact they had not sought. And the world that emerged from that collision, the modern world, was built on that price. The wealth that funded the European Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, and eventually the Industrial Revolution, all of it was drawing, in part, on the capital extracted from the Americas. The philosophical ideas about liberty and human rights that animated the American and French revolutions were developed, with profound irony, in societies that practiced mass slavery. The contradictions run all the way down. And here at the end is where I want to leave you with something to carry with you. On the night of October 11th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana was standing watch on the Pinta, straining his eyes into a darkness he had been staring into for weeks. He did not know he was about to change the world. He did not know that the white line he was about to see on the horizon would be the boundary between two ages of human history. He was a poor Spanish sailor doing his job, hoping to get home alive, hoping to earn his reward, hoping the next morning would bring something different from all the mornings before. And it did. It brought everything different. It brought the end of one world and the beginning of another. And he did not get the credit for it, and he did not get the money, and history barely remembers his name. But Rodrigo de Triana saw the New World first, before Columbus, before the flags and the crosses and the royal proclamations, before the violence and the empires and the silver fleets and the slave ships, before all of it. A poor sailor saw a coastline in the dark and shouted a word into the night air, and the word was land, and after that nothing was ever the same again. That is what history actually is. Not the kings and the contracts and the official documents, though those matter too. History is the moment before anyone knows what the moment means. It is the sailor in the dark, the light on the beach, the white line on the horizon. It is the feeling of standing at the edge of something you cannot name, knowing that whatever is on the other side of that darkness, the world you wake up to tomorrow will not be the world you went to sleep in last night. October 12th, 1492. The day everything changed. And whether you are on the ship or on the shore, whether your ancestors came as conquerors or as captives or as the people who were already there, that day is part of your story too. It is part of all of our stories. Because the modern world, with everything it contains, was born on that beach. And we are still, in ways we sometimes do not even recognize, living inside the consequences of that single morning. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and I want you to think seriously about it. If you could go back and change one decision made in the events surrounding October 12th, 1492, just one, what would it be? And what do you think would have happened next? Leave your answer in the comments below. There are no wrong answers. There is only the great, unresolved argument of history, the argument about what we are, where we came from, and what we owe to each other across the centuries. That argument began on a beach in 1492.